The law office of Bennett and Associates was unnaturally quiet as we watched Richard Maxwell's video will play on the large screen. My father-in-law's face, recorded just days before his death, filled the display, still commanding attention even from beyond the grave. "To my sons," he began, his voice strong despite his illness. "James and Thomas, one of you carries my blood, my legacy. The other," he paused, his eyes seeming to fix directly on my husband James. "The other was a charity case my late wife insisted we adopt." I felt James tense beside me. Across the table, Thomas's smirk grew wider. "My name is Katherine Maxwell, and I was watching my husband's world crumble, or so everyone thought. What they didn't know was that I had spent the last 6 months uncovering the truth about the Maxwell family's carefully guarded secrets. Maxwell Industries," Richard continued from the screen, "represents 5 generations of our family's hard work. It can only be entrusted to my real son, the one who carries my blood." James's hand tightened around mine. For 35 years, he had lived with the knowledge that he was adopted, but Richard had never been this cruel about it before. Always subtle jabs, always slight preferences shown to Thomas, but never this open rejection. "Therefore," Richard declared, "I leave controlling interest in Maxwell Industries to Thomas, my true son and heir." Thomas sat up straighter, practically preening. "Blood is thicker than water," he said softly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. If only they knew. 6 months ago, while organizing old family documents in preparation for Richard's declining health, I had found something strange, inconsistencies in the adoption papers, small details that didn't quite add up. My journalist's instincts, honed over years of investigative reporting, kicked in. What I uncovered would shake the Maxwell family to its core. "Mr. Bennett," Thomas said to the family lawyer, barely containing his glee, "I assume the paperwork is ready for me to take control immediately?" Harold Bennett, who had been the Maxwell family's lawyer for over 40 years, adjusted his glasses. "Actually, there are a few more provisions of the will to address." I caught the slight tremor in his voice. He had received my email this morning, along with all the evidence I had gathered. Richard Maxwell's wishes were clear. Thomas pressed. "The company goes to his real son." "That's me. What else is there to discuss?" "Perhaps we should all take a moment," I suggested, keeping my voice calm. "This is a lot to process." Thomas shot me a dismissive look. "I'm sure it is, Katherine. It must be difficult for you and James to accept that you won't be part of the Maxwell legacy after all. But really, what did you expect? James was never really one of us." My mother-in-law, Margaret, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Thomas, please. Your father may have made his decision, but James is still your brother." "No, Mother, he's not," Thomas snapped. "That's the whole point. He's the orphan you felt sorry for and convinced Father to take in. Nothing more." I watched James absorb these barbs with the quiet dignity I had always admired in him. He had spent his entire life trying to prove himself worthy of the Maxwell name, working twice as hard as Thomas, earning every opportunity while Thomas coasted on charm and privilege. "Mr. Bennett," I said, "before we proceed, I believe there's something else that needs to be addressed." Thomas rolled his eyes. "What could possibly need to be addressed? The will is clear. The company goes to Father's real son." Me. "Yes," I agreed, "the company goes to Richard's real son. But there's a question we should consider first. Who was Richard's real son?" The room fell silent. I could feel everyone's eyes on me. "What are you talking about?" Thomas demanded, a note of uncertainty creeping into his voice. I pulled out a folder and slid it across the table to Mr. Bennett. "I've spent the last 6 months conducting an investigation. What I found was interesting." Mr. Bennett opened the folder, his eyes widening as he reviewed the contents. "This is ridiculous," Thomas scoffed. "What kind of investigation? You're a journalist, not a detective." "Actually," I said, "being a journalist is exactly what helped me uncover the truth. You see, I'm very good at following paper trails, connecting dots, finding people who remember things others would rather forget." I turned to Margaret. "Would you like to tell them, or should I?" My mother-in-law's face had gone pale. How did you find out?" "Find out what?" James asked, looking between us. I took his hand again, squeezing it gently. "The adoption papers I found 6 months ago. They weren't for you, James. They were for Thomas." The room erupted in chaos. Thomas jumped to his feet, his face red with anger. "You're lying. This is some desperate attempt to steal what's rightfully mine." "No," Margaret said quietly, tears in her eyes. "She's telling the truth." James stared at his mother in shock. "What?" Margaret's hands trembled as she spoke. "Your father and I, we couldn't have children. We adopted Thomas when he was an infant. But then, a year later, I discovered I was pregnant. A miracle, the doctors called it. You, James, you're our biological son." Thomas slumped back into his chair, the color draining from his face. "That's impossible. Father he always treated me as his real son." "Because he didn't know," Margaret whispered. "I never told him. He was so proud of his bloodline, so obsessed with passing on the Maxwell legacy. I couldn't bear to tell him the truth." Mr. Bennett cleared his throat. "I have here." He gestured to the folder I had provided. "DNA test results confirming that James is, in fact, Richard and Margaret Maxwell's biological son, along with the original adoption papers for Thomas, which were cleverly hidden but never actually sealed." I watched as the implications of this revelation sank in. Richard's video will still play silently in the background, his words about blood and legacy taking on a whole new meaning. So I set into the heavy silence. According to Richard's own wishes, Maxwell Industries should go to his real son, his blood heir. That would be James. Thomas stood up so abruptly his chair toppled backward. "No, this is a trick. You falsified those documents." "The DNA tests were conducted by 3 separate labs," I replied calmly. "And the adoption papers have been verified by multiple experts. Would you like to see their reports?" "Mother." Thomas turned to Margaret, his voice desperate. "Tell them they're wrong. Tell them I'm father's real son." But Margaret just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Thomas. I never meant for any of this to come out. I thought the truth would die with me." James had been silent through all of this, processing the shocking revelation. Finally, he spoke. "Why did you ever tell me?" "Because I wanted you both to feel equally loved," Margaret replied. "I didn't want either of you to feel more or less a part of this family because of biology." "Well, that worked out brilliantly, didn't it?" Thomas spat. "All these years, father treating me as his true heir, while his real son had to prove himself over and over." "Thomas," James said quietly, "this doesn't change that we're brothers. We grew up together, shared everything." "Shared?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "I took everything from you. Father's love, his pride, his trust. It was all meant for you, and I stole it. And you're sitting there talking about being brothers?" I watched my husband carefully, seeing the mixture of emotions play across his face. The hurt of years of subtle rejection from his father, the shock of learning he was the biological son, the pain of seeing his brother's true colors revealed. Mr. Bennett cleared his throat again. "Given these revelations and according to the explicit terms of Richard Maxwell's will, control of Maxwell Industries will pass to James as the biological son." "This isn't over," Thomas snarled, gathering his things. "I'll fight this. I'll prove these documents are fake." "No, you won't," I interrupted. "Because deep down, you've always known something wasn't quite right. Haven't you? The way Margaret would sometimes look at you with guilt in her eyes. The small discrepancies in your birth story that never quite added up." Thomas froze, and I saw the truth of my words hit him. He had known, or at least suspected, that something was off about his place in the family. "Why?" he whispered, looking at me. "Why did you have to dig this up? We were all happy before you started poking around in the past." I stood up, meeting his gaze steadily. "Because the truth matters, Thomas. Because James deserved to know who he really is. And because your father deserved to know too, even if he'll never get the chance now." The days following the will reading were a blur of legal meetings, press inquiries, and family drama. The news that Thomas Maxwell was adopted and James was the biological heir had sent shockwaves through Boston's business community. The story was too juicy to ignore. The prestigious Maxwell family secret exposed, the rightful heir reclaiming his birthright. I sat in our home office reviewing the mountain of paperwork Mr. Bennett had sent over when James came in looking exhausted. "Thomas is contesting the will," he said, loosening his tie. "He's claiming that regardless of biology, father's intention was for him to run the company." "Let him try," I replied, pulling up a document on my laptop. I found something else you should know about. James leaned over my shoulder, reading the email I'd uncovered. His eyes widened. Is this real? Very. Your father was starting to suspect the truth before he died. He'd hired a private investigator 3 months ago. The email was from Richard Maxwell to his private investigator, expressing doubts about Thomas's heritage. He'd noticed things over the years, small inconsistencies in Margaret's stories, certain family traits that Thomas didn't share. He'd been planning to confront Margaret about it, but his illness had progressed too quickly. So father died never knowing the truth, James said quietly. But he was looking for it, I pointed out. He sensed something wasn't right. Maybe that's why he was so harsh in the video, Will. He was trying to force the truth out. The doorbell rang, interrupting our conversation. It was Margaret, looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen her. Can we talk? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. I led her to the living room, where she sank into an armchair, clutching her handbag like a lifeline. Thomas won't speak to me, she said. He's moved out of the family house, won't take my calls. He's so angry. He has reason to be, James said, but his tone was gentle. You lied to him his entire life. Margaret nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I thought I was protecting everyone. Richard was so obsessed with carrying on the Maxwell bloodline. When we adopted Thomas, he was still struggling with the idea that he couldn't have children of his own. Then when I got pregnant with you, James, I was afraid. Afraid of what? I asked. Afraid that if Richard knew Thomas wasn't his biological son, he would treat him differently, that he would push him aside in favor of James. I couldn't bear the thought of my first baby feeling unwanted. So instead, James said, I grew up feeling unwanted. Watching father favor Thomas, hearing constant reminders that I wasn't a real Maxwell. Margaret's hands twisted in her lap. I never thought. I didn't realize how much Richard's preference for Thomas would hurt you. I thought since you knew you were adopted, you would understand why he sometimes treated me like a second-class son. James finished. Mother, do you have any idea what that did to me? Spending my entire life trying to prove myself worthy of a family that was actually mine by blood. I watched my husband finally express the pain he carried for so long. Years of subtle rejection, of having to work twice as hard for half the recognition, all because of a lie. I'm so sorry, Margaret whispered. I made a terrible mistake. I thought I was protecting my children, but I ended up hurting you both. Just then, my phone buzzed with a news alert. I opened it and sighed. Thomas has gone to the press. He's claiming we fabricated the DNA results to steal his inheritance. James ran a hand through his hair. Of course he has. He's always been good at playing the victim. I have to stop this, Margaret said suddenly, standing up. I have to tell the truth publicly. Are you sure? I asked. Once you do, there's no going back. She nodded, straightening her shoulders. I've lived with this lie for 35 years. It's destroyed my family. Maybe the truth can help us rebuild. The press conference was held the next day at Maxwell Industries headquarters. The room was packed with reporters, all eager to cover the latest twist in the Maxwell family saga. Margaret stood at the podium, looking both terrified and determined. James and I stood to one side, while Thomas lurked at the back of the room, his expression dark. 35 years ago, Margaret began, her voice shaking slightly. I made a decision that would affect my entire family. Today, I'm here to tell the truth about that decision. She told the whole story, the adoption of Thomas, the unexpected pregnancy with James, the decades of deception. As she spoke, I watched the reporters frantically taking notes, cameras flashing. I am solely responsible for this deception, she concluded. My sons, both my sons, are innocent victims of my choices. The DNA results that have been published are genuine. James is my biological child with Richard Maxwell. Thomas is our adopted son, who we have loved just as much from the day he came into our lives. The room erupted with questions, but I was watching Thomas. Something in his expression had changed as he listened to Margaret's confession. The anger was still there, but there was something else too, a hint of uncertainty, maybe even vulnerability. After the press conference, as we were leaving through a back entrance, Thomas approached us. James, he said, his voice rough. Can we talk? Alone? James looked at me and I nodded. I'll wait in a car. I watched through the car window as the brothers talked. Their conversation seemed intense, with both men gesturing animatedly, but they weren't shouting, which seemed like progress. After about 20 minutes, James returned to the car. "How did it go?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "He's hurt, confused, angry. But he's also my brother. Biology doesn't change that we grew up together, that we shared everything." "What about the company?" "We're going to run it together," James said. "Once the legal issues are sorted out, I want him as my co-CEO. He knows the business as well as I do, maybe better in some ways. We can be stronger together than we ever were competing against each other." I smiled, reaching for his hand. "You're a good man, James Maxwell. A better person than most would be in this situation." "I had a good teacher," he said, squeezing my hand. "You could have just shown me the adoption papers when you found them. Instead, you dug deeper, made sure you had the whole truth before bringing it to light." "The truth was what mattered," I replied. "Not revenge, not power, just truth." Over the next few months, the Maxwell family slowly began to heal. Thomas withdrew his legal challenges and accepted James' offer to run the company together. Margaret started therapy, working through her guilt and trying to rebuild relationships with both her sons. One evening, about 6 months after the will reading, we hosted a family dinner at our house. It was the first time since the revelation that everyone was together in one room. "I proposed a new division of the company today," Thomas announced over dessert. "Environmental technologies. It's time Maxwell Industries looked to the future instead of just protecting the past." That's what I've been saying for years," James said, surprised. Thomas smiled slightly. "I know, I should have listened sooner. Maybe if I hadn't been so focused on being father's real son, I would have seen how many good ideas you had." Margaret wiped tears from her eyes. "Your father would be proud of you both, not because of blood or birth, but because of who you've become." "No more secrets," I said, raising my glass. "No more lies. Just family with all its complications and imperfections." "To family," they echoed, and for the first time it felt real, not the carefully maintained image of the perfect Maxwell family, but something messier, more honest, and ultimately stronger. Later that night, as James and I got ready for bed, he pulled me close. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For not letting the truth stay buried, for giving me back my identity, my heritage. But most of all, for showing me that real family isn't about blood or birth. It's about love, truth, and acceptance." I thought about everything that had happened, the pain of revelation, the struggle for understanding, the slow journey toward healing. "Sometimes," I said, "the hardest truths lead us to the most important discoveries. About ourselves, about our families, about what really matters." "And what really matters?" he asked. I smiled, touching his face gently. "That we choose to be better than the lies that came before. That we build something real from the ashes of what was false. The Maxwell family would never be the same. But maybe that was the point. Sometimes it takes breaking apart to build something stronger, something truer. And in the end, isn't that what family is really about?"